we had dinner together, and she walked in, and she was quite a bit heavier than the last time I had seen her. And she's the first one to admit that. So I hope she won't kill me for saying that. But she was a vegan, a Dr. Grieger vegan, near vegan, not completely vegan, and quite sick, 56 pounds overweight. And I had my normal reaction to a vegan, which is, oh, Lord. But she asked me what I was doing, because, this is what always happens to me when I go out to dinner with people is, I'm acutely gluten intolerant. So I've got to have this negotiation with the waiter on what I can eat. And all I had was sausages and nothing else and no vegetables. So she started asking me, and I told her basically a sentence. She said, what should I do? And I said, avoid seed oils, refine carbohydrates, and make sure that you eat lots of animal protein and animal fats. Right? It was a sentence. Because she was a vegan. I figured she wouldn't do it. I wanted to say as little as possible because I didn't want to get into an argument with a vegan. So a couple of weeks later, she calls me up and she says, okay, so I'm doing what you told me to do, and I've lost 17 pounds so far. And she wound up down 56 pounds in 2.5 months, back to her high school weight, basically.
Wow.
And put her fibromyalgia that she'd had for decades completely into remission. She hasn't had any pain from fibromyalgia for, over probably 1.5 years now. That was a sentence.
Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak Ningen.
Peak Human. O melhor humano. Peak Epidemiology.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Peak Human. I'm Brian Sanders. Thank you for reviewing this podcast on iTunes or your podcast app and sharing with a friend. Please start back at episode 1. There's so many great episodes. Every day, almost, someone messaged me about how they started from the beginning, shared it with friends and family, have changed their life, changed others' lives. So many amazing people that I've interviewed. They get all the credit. They're doing all the great work. So don't let it go to waste and go listen to them all. So the news of the day is I'm going to Africa in 1 week. We're going to finish off a lot of the Food Lives filming there, live with some tribes. Really amazing opportunity, and going to make this Food Lives film extra special. Can't wait. The only problem is I won't be able to do this podcast for a few weeks. Gonna take a little break, come back for season 9 around the beginning of March. Can't wait to share all the great content as we get it. I'll be doing stuff on Instagram and doing some stories and all that. So this is probably the last episode until March, so please enjoy it. This was a special one. I had 2 guests, Dr. Cate Shanahan and Tucker Goodrich. I had Tucker on years ago for episode 20, and he laid out the entire case against seed oil, which was very compelling. Dr. Cate has been on twice already, more recently, and is a wealth of knowledge on many, many things, especially the dangers of seed oils and reinforcing the Sapien diet concepts, which I like. We cover how people get fat and sick all the way down to the mitochondrial level. We discuss the different players in this process, including seed oils, or more specifically, excess amounts of omega-6, refined grains, and sugar. We also do my favorite thing and look at all sides of the arguments. We use an article a seed oil supporter wrote as a tool to check in on the studies and claims cited. You won't want to miss this one. It's a long one, but we cover a lot, and there's a bunch of great info. So just want to say this podcast is made possible by my company Nose to Tail, where we offer nutrient-dense whole foods delivered to you. I have no other sponsors. I don't take money from anyone. And this is a community-powered endeavor. I source and produce great products that I believe in that are from regenerative farmers, sustainable agriculture, and you, the consumer, get that valuable product delivered to you. It's all done online. We don't have any middlemen. You can go to nosetotail.org, check out our offerings. We have the fresh meat products out of Texas. And then we also have all of our other products like the South African biltong and drovors, the beef tallow body care products, soap, skin food, and lip balm. We have our clean seasonings that I use every day with all my cooking. And we have some other stuff like our great hats with a steak on it and some really amazing artwork by our good pal Yuli in the UK. So check all of those out. Really high quality stuff. The beef is all grass-fed, grass-finished, ethically raised, the whole deal. Low omega-6 content. We have the primal ground beef with the organs mixed in. And our special product, which is particularly appropriate for the content of this show, is our pork and chicken with the low omega-6 ratio, very low omega-6 from our special diet we feed them that is very expensive and proprietary. And we've had this independently lab tested and verified, very low, an almost 1-to-1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, which is amazing. It's less than 2-to-1. Most conventional products are around 20-to-1, so this is huge. You can make a box for yourself with all the great products. And I'm adding more today. I'm adding goat. If anyone wants to try some goat, I'm adding goat today. You can make a box, free shipping over 20 pounds. It's really better to buy in bulk. You get a discount and it helps us make the service possible by buying in bulk. We're just stocking back up on the body care products made from regeneratively grown beef tallow. We keep running out. So sorry if there's a few people who haven't got their orders because we sold out too quickly. Restocking today. Handmade by my buddy Tommy. Really great stuff. We're going to ramp up production soon. Don't forget about the seasonings. Seriously use them in every meal. My new trick, a Ted Naiman P to E ratio, high protein to energy. The only low-fat product I've ever used is Greek yogurt without fat for a protein boost, but it's still a clean product. And I mix in the Dillon Ranch seasoning to make something that's way better than any ranch you could ever buy in a bottle. Add a little extra salt and pepper and put it on any meats, anything you eat, it makes it better. All the seasonings you can do that with. That's all at knowsthetale.org. That's all I'll say for now. And of course, Sapien.org is our main company, our health education company I do with Dr. Gary. We have the Sapien program where we guide you through a 10-week class online with health coaches to make some big dietary changes, big weight loss is going on there. And then the Sapien tribe, we just did a free breathwork session. It was so cool. I've never done it. We did about 25 minutes and it felt like I was in a different universe. I really got to a different level just by using breathing techniques. Very cool. We do these kinds of things all the time where we have special Zoom calls and content for the tribe, special bonus episodes and information. And now we have great discount codes to Nose to Tail. We have 10% off all fresh meat products and 20% off everything else. This is a great discount, no order minimum, unlimited use for Sapien Tribe members. It's a great perk I just added because I appreciate the community. So join us there, go to sapien.org and click through to the tribe page. And that's it. Let's get on to the show with Dr. Cate Shanahan and Tucker Goodrich. All right, we're live with our seed oil team. We have Tucker Goodrich and we have Dr. Cate Shanahan. How are you guys doing?
Very good. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to get together and have a roundtable discussion of sorts. We're going to deep dive into seed oils, and I want to talk about why are we fat and sick. Let's do the ultimate podcast on why are we fat and sick. No one wants to be fat and sick. Yeah, we've ended up here, and it may land on seed oils, and there may be some other things that help drive it. But we're gonna do a big discussion on this, and even look at some of the counterpoints. So we used an article that I sent as a sort of outline of what to go off of to look at the counterpoints so we can make sure we debunk them and just more solidify our stance. So I just before we started talking, you guys were talking about how you've been following each other's work for years, and it's great that you guys are fans of each other. So anything there to start off?
Well, when I started trying to figure out what was going on with me, Dr. Cate was one of the few people who had this method. And because of my experience, I was pretty sure that seed oils played an important part on it. And, as she said also, it's nice. Misery loves company. It's nice to realize there's somebody else out there, especially an MD, in my case, since I'm not an MD, who believes the thing that you think is likely to be your own problem. And that was definitely an inspiration for me to keep digging and trying to figure out what the mechanisms were.
Well, thanks for saying that. I've been in this for a long time, and when I first started, it was 2002, and the thing that struck me as kind of a obvious, wow, this could explain everything, was just oxidation of parts of our body. And there was actually a woman's PhD thesis that had chemistry in there that just made so much sense to me. It helped me understand, oh, okay, this is why everybody's suffering from inflammation. This is why all these diseases we talk about, arteriosclerosis and brain diseases like Alzheimer, other neurodegenerative diseases, they all talk about inflammation coming from oxidative stress. So the woman actually who did the PhD thesis was Eva Sodergren, and one of the articles that we're going to talk about is co-written by her, which was a absolute shock to me. That's why I want to go take a deep dive into that one, because she was my inspiration for understanding that these could potentially be like the Rosetta Stone explaining the link between all of the diseases I was seeing in my patients every day that medical science had zero answers for, and that medical science protected the sale of seed oils by making us doctors terrified of recommending saturated fat because it would raise blood cholesterol. So it was a
more than protect, encourage.
Yes, right. But if you are, it's scary. It was very scary for me the first time I ever said. It took me 2 years before I went from, gosh, I wonder if this could be it. I wonder if butter is actually good for you, before I could actually say, and lard is too. Right. It was just such a foreign concept, and it took another bunch of years before I realized, even though we call it LDL is bad cholesterol, that LDL and HDL are both good cholesterol as long as your diet is good. So the consumption of massive amount of calories from seed oils, right now we're somewhere around 30% of the average American's calories come from these oils that didn't exist before the industrial era. That is something that stands out and needs to be brought out into the light in terms of like the mainstream medicine, but it can't happen because of the fear of saturated fat. So there's a perfect balance of fear and incentivization to just continue in the same line, and sometimes even just clock out, like, oh, I'm not interested in nutrition. Doctors have done that.
Right.
But it doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into all these details. I want to start a little higher because I'm working on the Food Lies film now, and we're talking about knowing the enemy, right? And if you have the wrong enemy, you're not going to ever solve the problem, right? The problem is chronic disease and obesity. So if we should talk about what are the different theories, right? What are the different theories of the enemy? And so far, it's been saturated fat and red meat, and that's the enemy. And we've been fighting it for decades, and it's not worked. It's only gotten worse. So we're proposing in the film, and everyone listening should be aware of this. Well, what if there's this other enemy, and it's seed oils or refined grains and sugars? And we can talk about the different roles that those three play, but that's the thesis of the film, and everything that a lot of our community does is saying these are the problems. Let's focus on these. Let's get the right enemy. The enemy is not saturated fat. Then we can move on with our lives and start addressing how to fix this problem and how to get people to eat less of these and all that stuff. So
Amen to that.
I did it. Yeah. So I did this like hammer nail graphic that I like, and it's a hammer nail going into the coffin, right? This is how you get sick and die. The seed oils are probably the hammer. These are probably the most important part driving it. And then the nail is just setting up the problem, is the refined grains and sugars that people are overeating. Overeating, which, constant oversupply, hyperpalatable foods that are creating this bad environment for the seed oils to maybe put the hammer. So maybe we can start off by just is that how each of you think of it, or what? Maybe Tucker can start.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do think that it's the ultimate cause of a lot of our problems. And I will add the caveat that there are lots of other factors that play into it and are related, because they're all related to the shared mechanism of oxidative stress, as Dr. Cate said before. So smoking increases oxidative stress, right? Smoking increases your risk of getting diabetes, oddly enough, because that's also a product of increased oxidative stress. So with the caveat that there are lots of, and carbohydrate intake in the context of a high seed oil diet goes from being slightly harmful to exceedingly harmful. So, I consider myself part of the low carb, high fat group, but I don't think that carbs, for instance, are what is really driving this, but seed oils are a major confounder for carb consumption. And we can get into some of those indications that it is indeed a confounder. But I think if there's one change that you can do to your diet, that this is definitely the one that's going to have the most impact on your blanket health situation.
Is removing the seed oils. Okay.
Is removing
And Dr. Cate?
Yeah, so I think to your hammer and nail, I think we want to explain to understand whether seed oils are more harmful metabolically than sugar. We are missing the mechanistic link between sugar consumption and insulin resistance, which is the precursor to all these metabolic diseases, right? Weight gain, diabetes, pre-diabetes, and then type 2 diabetes. It all comes down to insulin resistance. And right now, there's not a great explanation for how does sugar do it, other than, well, it wears out the system. You're just constantly eating sugar, and your pancreas basically gets pooped out of producing too much insulin, or your liver can't stuff more sugar into the liver in the form of fat, and it can't get out of the liver because of some kind of convoluted mechanistic explanation. But what makes a lot more sense to me is that when your diet is as full of PUFAs, seed oils are high in PUFA, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, as our diets are, the average person gets 30-40% of their calories from seed oils and 80% of their fat calories from seed oils, which are mostly polyunsaturated fatty acids. What really struck me as how these things are absolutely the guilty party is that for diabetes, I mean, there's a lot of other reasons for a lot of other things, but when we look at diabetes, we have to understand how these things affect the mitochondria. When the mitochondria try to burn them for energy, and it shuts them down, the seed oils basically cause the mitochondria to blow a fuse. That's what the uncoupling proteins 2 and 3, I believe, are actually activated by too much PUFA concentration in any given cell, and the mitochondria shut down, no more ATP. What's the cell going to do? Frantically looking around, what else can I put in here? What else can I burn? Because PUFA is not working, fat's not working. Well, I know there's always some sugar in the bloodstream, so it starts slurping in more sugar. And you do that in cell after cell, tissue after tissue, and your body suddenly has a higher requirement for blood sugar. And guess what? Your set point for your fasting blood sugar goes up. That is the first indication of insulin resistance. And it's a great explanation for something I see all the time, which is more advanced type 2 diabetics. They'll wake up with a fasting blood sugar of 70, right? They went to bed, their fasting blood sugar was good. They wake up and it's, I'm sorry, not 70. Why did I say that? 70, 140. I halved it for something. So they'll wake up with 140, then they'll go about their day after eating a breakfast that's high in carb, and their blood sugar will come down to 110. What's going on there is very important to understand. It's that, and I mean, I can elaborate, but I don't want to, I don't know if I'm going into the weeds too much.
Oh, you can, no, go into the weeds. This is the time.
Great, here we go. So, so what's going on there is the brain needs sugar, because when you are type 2 diabetic, you're almost never really delivering significant amounts of ketones. In the early phases of type 2 diabetes, you almost never get significant amount of ketones. So the brain needs sugar. You're not getting the body fat liberated for the most part because your insulin levels are too high. So the brain simply says to the liver, make more sugar for me. I don't care if for millennia, the fasting blood sugar of a human being in most mammals has been under 90. I need it to be higher. I need it to be 100, 110, 140, 160, sometimes 200, because the brain says, I'm not getting energy from your body fat, sir or ma'am. So please, Mr. Liver, could you do more of that gluconeogenesis stuff that you do with protein, where you break down your body's muscle or you break down your dietary protein and turn it into sugar so that I can burn it for energy? Or sometimes they just break down the amino acids into, things like the amino acids like glutamate. They can easily also be metabolized by the brain for energy, but that's not the point of eating protein, right? Like we need protein in our diet, mostly for building blocks and regulatory things, not for fuel. But you look at any type 2 diabetic and their gluconeogenesis is through the roof. And that's why they get the skinny legs. That's why they can't put on weight. I've had patients that actually got diabetes type 2 from eating low carb and low fat, but the protein that they were eating, which is almost their only fuel, caused them to just go more accelerated into this creating sugar out of protein. And there's research that shows that certain amino acids overstimulate gluconeogenesis in insulin-resistant people. And so that to me is a much more, I know it's a little convoluted and we have organs arguing with each other, right? The brain is bossing the liver and the pancreas is saying, wait a second, I need the blood sugar to be down because too much sugar is toxic to my cells and I'm going to push out more insulin. So the brain is saying to the liver, push out sugar, do gluconeogenesis, an opposite process. You cannot do gluconeogenesis and build fat at the same time. They're opposite processes. So it's doing gluconeogenesis. The pancreas is pushing out more insulin because it's like, come on, this sugar is still here still. Mr. Liver, why aren't you listening? Well, Mr. Liver isn't listening because the brain wins. The brain is hardwired through the vagus nerve to control the liver and the pancreas. And some of this is happening in both organs, the gluconeogenesis. But the very beginnings of insulin resistance, they're finding it is accelerated gluconeogenesis in the liver. It's not fatty liver, like I hear a lot of folks talking about in the whole low carb community. It's not fatty liver from fructose. I mean, I'm not saying you should go out and eat high fructose corn syrup or that stuff isn't addicting. It's going to make you overeat. It's going to make you hungry. It causes glycation, especially once you have had that hammer. And now you can't regulate your blood sugar. So you're going to get spikes in the 200s and 300s, which more rapidly promote oxidative stress and glycation and just general dysfunction and cellular mayhem. But it comes from, there's probably other factors, but in my mind, the simplest, most guilty party is this reality that mitochondria simply cannot produce ATP efficiently. And we're never designed to burn polyunsaturated fatty acids for fuel for the simple reason that we didn't have them, right? They're pretty rare, especially on a human diet, which is, pretty, heavy in meat and probably readily available carbohydrates, which make your body builds saturated fat out of those things. So, and that's for a reason, because saturated fat and monounsaturated fat make excellent fuel for the mitochondria. So when you look at that's, to me, like that's the answer. When I saw that study, that was another aha moment, like as powerful as when I saw Eva Sodergren's PhD thesis on the peroxidation of polyunsaturated fatty acids in vivo, which means in potentially in the bloodstream, which the American Heart Association says cannot happen and has never been proved to happen.
Tucker?
Wow.
There's a lot.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just a couple of supporting materials. I was like doing my best not to raise my hand. No, because I was like, wait, and then there's this, and then there's this. Total parenteral nutrition, which is feeding very sick people intravenously. They use soybean oil and sugar. And one of the major immediate side effects of doing that is hyperglycemia. So there's an immediate reaction of the body to an infusion of polyunsaturated fat to overproduce glucose in the liver. Of course, the ultimate result of that is typically liver failure. So exactly as Dr. Cate was saying, we have a clear human model that happens every day in hospitals all around the world where we are using polyunsaturated fats to induce hyperglycemia and then liver failure. Interestingly enough, they've now noticed that if they either don't use seed oils or they use fish oil instead of seed oils, now that's a really interesting point. Even if they use just glucose, it's less harmful, or dextrose, I think is what they use. It's less harmful than dextrose and seed oils, where if they use dextrose and fish oil, omega-3 fats, it's much less harmful. Just taking the omega-6 polyunsaturated fats makes it a healthy process rather than something that is dangerous enough so that the FDA has a mortality warning on these products, right? So this is, in my view, the best example of this process that Dr. Cate was just talking about, because it's, been vetted by the FDA and it's used in medical practice all around the world. I totally totally support that whole statement.
That's good.
Okay.
Nicely done.
Win
And
one for seed oil team.
Keto, yeah.
Small team.
Well, and just to make sure, we're kind of mostly talking about the omega-6, the linoleic acid, and maybe we could talk about the difference into the omega-3s, because these are more natural. These are what's found in seafood, and the omega-6s are the more dangerous ones that are found in seed oil, the seeds and stuff that we're not evolutionarily used to.
Well, okay. So both omega-6 and omega-3 fats would be found if you're eating a whole foods diet. You're going to get both, right?
Yeah.
In plants, you're going to get the short chain versions, linoleic acid and alpha linolenic acid, and in animal foods, you're going to get the longer chain versions, arachidonic acid, DHA, and EPA. So these are all things that we're supposed to be getting and that our bodies expect us to be getting, right? The problem is when you start adding industrial processing of these plant products, you're able to generate massive amounts of these and just to be clear, excess fish oil is also probably harmful. It's just that it's much less harmful. So ideally what you're looking to do is get the amount and types of these fats that your body evolved for and not pump it full of a wildly excess amount. I mean, people can get water poisoning, right? This is something Professor Tim Noakes identified. If you drink too much water, for certain people, it will kill them, right? That doesn't mean that water is harmful or bad. It just means that you need an appropriate dose of it. And seed oils are the same. These PUFAs are the same thing. Your body expects them, your body needs them, but you need small amounts of the sort you'd get in whole foods, not the amount that you get from a gallon jug of Wesson corn oil, which we would never have encountered in our evolutionary past. So I want to be mindful. I encounter people on Twitter and the internet are saying, well, how do I eliminate all of these things? You don't need to. You don't want to. It's a bad idea. But you want to eliminate the industrial quantity sources of these things.
Yeah, and just to kind of elaborate on how much do people actually need, at the turn of the century, adipose tissue that was biopsied, so fat tissue that was biopsied and analyzed for polyunsaturated fatty acid content, which is the best reflection of a person's chronic long-term diet, what they're actually doing, was somewhere around 2%, 3%. And now there are folks who are running around with PUFAs up as high as 30, 35%. And it's going to vary depending on their diet, of course. But that is insane, because that means that, so we have to release, in order to lose weight, we have to release these fats stored in our body fat, and they have to be burned. And if someone is at a typical, say, 50-something person who's diabetic, they've been eating seed oils for decades. They probably are somewhere around 20, 30% of the PUFAs in their body fat. They're not going to feel so good. Some people are fine, but some people don't feel so good when they jump right into fasting, because their body fat is so pro-inflammatory that it's causing inflammation in the cells that are trying to use it for fuel. Not everybody has these symptoms, but some people do. And you can actually measure that their body temperature goes up because there's so much stray, useless energy being produced by the mitochondria when they're burning more PUFA. They do this in mice, not people. But they're actually hotter in spite of being less physically active. That is, energy has to go somewhere, right? So if you're burning polyunsaturated fatty acids that essentially fly apart, they kind of explode. These things called free radical cascades are kind of miniature explosions. That is what the consumption of too much PUFA does. It causes all these free radical cascades, miniature explosions, damaging the fats in your cell membrane. And that energy doesn't, it doesn't just politely disappear, right? It actually causes, That's where the oxidative stress comes from, but it's to such a degree that you can actually measure rises in body temperature. And I think that has a lot to do with why the thyroid is so prone to problems now, because again, with set points, we have a set point with our body temperature too, and the thyroid's kind of in charge of maintaining that. And if you exercise and your body temperature goes way up out of control, talk to people who are overweight and have been eating PUFAs and ask them, how do they feel when they're active? Like, how do they feel when they're rushing around at work? I'm not talking about major exercise. I just mean you're kind of in a hurry going up the stairs. And more than half of them have told me, I get really hot. And it just never occurred to me that it was beyond insulation. But, reading into it more, I think it's beyond insulation. And it's just an example of the profound changes to our whole body. What does that do to the thyroid? Why is it that so many people who are overweight now have mild thyroid abnormalities, thyroid antibodies? They've got nodules on their thyroid. They get thyroid cancer. Why is there so much going on with the thyroid? I don't think that's carbohydrate. I don't. I think it's the PUFAs and the inflammation. Just one of many tissues that are just devastated by this stuff.
Yeah. Well, anything to add, Tucker?
No, not to that. I mean, thyroid's interesting. One of the things the thyroid does, if you're typically, when you see these, one of the things that they see in obese people is that they're carbohydrate dependent, and it gets bad enough so that their cells restructure to move the fat supply away from the mitochondria. So they literally can't access fat. And one of the things that that your thyroid does is upregulate your body temperature as to dispose of excess glucose. That's what it's there for, right? Unlike fat, which your body stores 100% of, your body can't store 100% of glucose typically, because if you're not an active person, your glycogen stores are already full. So it's kind of like at oil derricks, they used to burn off the waste natural gas. That's what your body has to do with the excess glucose. If you're a glucose dependent person, you're going to be consuming too much, and you're going to have to get rid of it.
You can turn it into fat. Like once your glycogen stores are full, that's totally
You turn
true.
some of it into fat, but not all.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and the excess doesn't all go to fat.
Right, sure. Because, your cells are sugar dependent. So they're going to want, more sugar than fat, like you said. Right. So it's interesting what happens in terms of priority of different fuels getting into the mitochondria to be burned. Sugar supposedly has some kind of a priority. And PUFAs have a priority because it's not like it's on purpose. It's just that they're fluid and they wiggle into it. They wiggle into our cell membranes. We can't really control it very well. And so they wiggle all the way into the mitochondria. And I think maybe it was you or somebody else who writes about this, specifically the cardiolipin and the mitochondria and how.
Yeah, that's probably me.
Yeah.
I've been beating the drum on that for a couple of years now.
So how like the PUFAs just wiggle their way through cell membranes, and then they wiggle their way down a concentration gradient into the cell membranes of the mitochondria, where they wiggle their way out and then go, react, right? You get the beta oxidation and all that kind of stuff. But yes, it's a lot more complicated than we've come to understand. There's actually when you're fat adapted, your peroxisomes, which are things that help you break up polyunsaturated fatty acids, they also help you generate oxidative stress on purpose. They're in every cell. They team up with mitochondria. And there's evidence from a Russian study that I had to translate with Google Translate that is just fascinating. And it says our whole idea of beta oxidation is overwrought and overly complicated. What would happen is that, say you have olive oil, which is a monounsaturated fat, and that olive oil goes to the peroxisome. It's got one single double bond right smack in the middle, and the peroxisome breaks that in half. Now you have two 7 or 8 chain carbons which don't need any extra help getting into the mitochondria. So they get right in quickly too. And so this is a much more efficient way that your body can actually use fat for fuel very quickly that nobody except for these Russians are talking about. And it's so profoundly important because it explains something that no one has been able to explain, which is why would MCT oil, which is basically, refined coconut oil, why would that be something that gives us such efficient energy? And what I just described is a process by which your peroxisomes turn olive oil into 2 pieces of MCT oil, and now they zoom right into the mitochondria, massively efficient fuel. That's what fat adaptation, I believe, should be like. So we don't have to, it's just very efficient. It's much quicker.
Wow. Well, we did get into some weeds. We can jump back out for a second because before we lose everyone, I was just kind of thinking about our audience just to make sure I love it all because some people are really interested in these mechanisms, and I am too. But
I mean, we're not the only 3 nerds.
I hope not. I think people are into all this stuff. So I was listening to my episode with Tucker back, episode number 20, that he years ago laid out this whole story of why seed oils are bad, some high-level studies, some epidemiology, some looking at different populations, and showing that even the populations eating high-carb diets, pretty much a whole food carb diets, right, around the world, and they were still doing fine. So for one, I wanted to say, go back and check out that episode. I also did 2 episodes with Dr. Cate, so go back and check out those if you're new to this podcast. But maybe Tucker could do a little recap of that that old show, or just this general idea of that it is the seed oils, not the the whole food carbs that people are eating for all of history.
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, epidemiology is kind of a problem, right? But what's also, just because it's really hard to look at what people are eating and figure out, especially when you start looking into the past, and especially epidemiology as a science typically gets around that by only looking at first world countries, right? But there are lots of cases where we can go look at populations that aren't industrial, or older populations that weren't eating a high seed oil diet while they were industrial, and look at what has happened to those people since then. And what we see universally, I say that there may be a black swan out there, but I'm not aware of it yet. Universally, what we see is there are these diseases called the diseases of civilization, or Western diseases, or the diseases of affluence, that have all emerged in populations that are introduced to what I like to call an industrial diet. So there are populations like the Catawans. There's another population in the Polynesian Islands, the name of which I can never remember. They were this particular population. That's it.
There's
oh
a
my God, I'm so impressed.
Mm-hmm.
They eat 90% of their diet as carbohydrates, and the meat they get is pork. But what they don't get is diabetes and obesity, and they are well muscled and healthy into old age. The Japanese, prior to the American occupation at the end of World War II, similarly very high carbohydrate diet and not much obesity. The Japanese still don't have much obesity, although they've gotten fatter over the years. So if you're going to argue, or you can look at America. I mean, America in the early 20th century ate about as much carbs as we eat now. And if you go back and look at any pictures, I mean, Dr. Eads did this in a presentation of his I watched recently. They were all thin, right? Americans were all thin. There's a great example of this is watch the movie True Grit, right? Which was remade probably 10, 15 years ago. The original was from the 60s. And I watched them back to back one night, and it's unbelievable. There's nobody who's overweight in the first one. And then in the second one, everybody's overweight. Well, what happened? It wasn't, it's been such a dramatic change, but not a dramatic change that correlates with the introduction of carbohydrates into different countries. In fact, in Japan, carbohydrate consumption has gone down since the end of World War II, and yet obesity's gone up. Same thing has happened in China. Chinese have a higher obesity problem now than Americans do in children, and they eat fewer carbohydrates, which is kind of mind-boggling. So that's a hypothesis with literally flocks of black swans flying around it, right? It's quite easy to find things that don't work with that hypothesis. Now, I'm not saying a high-carb diet is a great idea or plan A, but I don't think it explains our epidemic of obesity and chronic diseases. But if you look at India, is a fascinating country. The oldest vegetarian population in the world is in India, the Jains. Indians basically invented diabetes. The oldest recorded description of diabetes as a disease comes from India. And India is one of the countries that has the longest, because of their history of vegetarian eating, the longest records of eating seed oils, right? And they have a long history of high rates of heart disease and high rates of diabetes. I'll repeat myself. So then we start looking at, Weston Price described this. One of the things he noted when he went around the world was how healthy all of these traditional populations were. And he described the foods that wrecked them. Part of it was vegetable fats. So I think, trying to account for all of the evidence, you just keep coming back to this conclusion that something had to change that was relatively recent, right? Carbohydrates have been in the human diet for 10,000 years. That was relatively recent and novel to the human diet. And the only population where it's not really novel is the Indians, and they seem to have the oldest history of diabetes that we're aware of. So I think that's kind of I hope a high enough level recap.
Yeah. Dr. Cate, maybe you can add to that. No, I like it. And you can go, there's more in the old episode we did with Tucker. And then, Dr. Cate, maybe you can add to that.
Which was like 2 hours long, so I'm definitely cutting things down a lot.
Yeah.
Well, interesting. India, there's a researcher that I know, Sanjoy Ghosh at Vancouver, who is from India, and his mother, he got into what he does, which is understand how PUFAs cause disease. Because his mother developed diabetes when he was a little kid, and she wasn't particularly overweight, but she was a little overweight. And his observation as a little kid was, well, look, okay, so in certain castes in India, you've always had people who didn't do that much activity. But like the seed oils that they did have, they were, it was like mustard oil was a common one, but that is extremely high in antioxidants and was not used like over and over again. It was precious. And so for him, he was like, corn oil, I see corn oil everywhere. And, it's not as much as we are here. But for him, that was the thing that he spent his life working on. And he actually did publish a study that shows that corn oil makes mice and people lazy, and it has to do with the inability of our mitochondria to produce energy from the stuff. And so we'd rather just sit around. We feel or it has to do with the fact that there's something called the oxidation that I was talking about, where you actually produce these free radicals instead of producing ATP, and you produce heat, and it just makes you feel bad. It's also inflammation. So people just don't feel like being active. So when I talk to people, I like to let them know, like on a high level thing, here, all you got to do is stop eating the seed oils and start eating healthy fats, because those healthy fats are going to retrain your brain that fat is a safe source of energy. You will crave carbohydrates so much less. Some people don't even miss them at all. And that is a huge recurring pattern, a recurring theme that I see when I work with people. It's like, I just added in these extra things, and I tell people not to snack, right? Because snacks are mostly junk food and they get out of control. You have to have a little snack here, a little snack there. So that's one of the simple rules I tell people. No more seed oils, eat healthy fats, and don't snack. And basically make sure you get enough protein in your diet, have some fresh foods so you can get some antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, and that's it. And people say that it's so easy because it doesn't feel restrictive. Nobody misses canola oil when they start, when they cut it out. And plus, now they can enjoy their butter and their cheese and their eggs and their other things that have so much flavor and so much nutrition. So it really resets your relationship with food on a fundamental level, because everybody talks about sugar like it's addicting, right? Sugar is hedonistic. It gives you a pleasure response. Like, oh God, that was so good. Your eyes roll back. That's part of it. But when you have a metabolic sugar addiction, there's no way you're going to beat that hedonistic sugar addiction until you fix the metabolic sugar addiction. It's just not going to happen. So that's my priority is helping people understand, okay, if you have a sweet tooth, let's pay attention to that. And let's make sure you're getting healthy fats and, give you carbs, but they have to be healthier carbs. Try to take them down gradually, change diet gradually. But so many people have said, I just added in healthy fats, took out the seed oils, did a couple of the things that I recommend around carbohydrates, which are the slow digesting carbohydrates. I sprout the grains, try to sprout and soak beans if you have that kind of thing, have sprouted grain bread. And they're like, this is easy. I feel great. I never thought I would lose 40 pounds. I never even thought I would lose 10 pounds. And I'm not missing anything. And I didn't have to talk to them, right? They read the book.
Yeah.
So
that's
it's autopilot.
So what she just described was exactly what happened to me and what got me into this whole thing. So I, was a typical gain a pound a year person. I was in my late 30s, so I was 20 pounds overweight. And for a variety of reasons, I did what probably no one except Dr. Cate's patients do, which was decide to cut seed oils out of my diet first, right? I had tried going on a low carb diet before, but I had never been able to get around the carb cravings. And when I dropped seed oils, I found I forgot to eat carbohydrates for a week. Just forgot, just didn't occur to me. Which was also how I discovered I was gluten intolerant, because the first thing I had was sandwich and just got walloped by the wheat. So that was kind of a win-win situation. But that was one of the things that it took me a long time to figure out what the mechanism for that was, right? So there's actually an animal model, which is also a human model of what they call hyperphagia, which is overeating, right? So seed oils convert in the body into a chemical called 2-AG, which causes you to overeat. So if you take a rat and you feed it until it stops eating, and you inject 2-AG into its brain, it will immediately start eating again, right? 2-AG is the chemical that tells your body that it's starving, right? That it's not eating and it's not getting enough calories. So seed oils convert in the body into this chemical, right? Now, the human aspect of this is that this process is blocked by a drug called rimonabant, right? So if you have an obese mouse and made obese by eating excess seed oils, and you give it rimonabant, it will cure the obesity. It will also cure some other things, which are kind of odd. But rimonabant was a human-approved anti-obesity drug. So we know that this pathway also works in humans. And typically, obese humans have high levels of 2-AG. Now, unfortunately, rimonabant had a side effect of causing people to want to kill themselves, so it was yanked from the market. But this is one of the best open and shut cases for a pathway that we have in obesity research. In fact, I would argue it's the only pathway that we have in obesity research that's been shown to induce obesity. And I'm trying to finish up a long post working on this, where even people who are skeptical about linoleic acid's role in obesity, like Stefan Guillenet, the studies that he quotes as being at the forefront of obesity research are in fact showing that linoleic acid is inducing obesity. And they're done by, okay, so enough on that topic. Back to Dr. Sanjoy Ghosh. I'm so excited to hear that you know him, because he actually happens to be the guy who wrote my favorite paper on this topic, which is called the most boring title ever.
Wait for it.
Brief episode of STZ-induced hyperglycemia produces cardiac abnormalities in rats fed a diet rich in N6-PUFA. And I have a long post on this on my blog, and I wrote at the end of it, I'll also note that I've been told that this paper was a Trojan horse, that the authors knew very well what the paper was going to show, but to get it published, kowtowed to the temple of vegetable oils to make it look like another cheerleading pro-PUFA study. Now, this is the one that most effectively shows the damage that a PUFA diet will induce. Now, these were rodents, but rodents on a high carbohydrate diet who are quite healthy, and then when they gave them PUFA, they developed diabetes, and then they induced hyperglycemia and induced heart failure. And they looked at everything Dr. Cate has been describing and that I've been describing for years is in this one paper, because they managed to produce mitochondrial dysfunction through feeding them PUFA alone. And then when they added hyperglycemia on top of that, they managed to collapse their mitochondria, which led to cardiac necrosis, which was the endpoint that they were looking at here. So they were able to induce heart failure. This is, for a long time, whenever I said to anybody, you want to understand my argument, read this paper, because this encapsulates the entire thing. And I'm really quite excited to hear that you know the author of that, and that my supposition that he knew what he was doing when he wrote this paper was true. That's kind of a cool story to hear.
Yeah, he's really awesome.
It's not a new paper, it's an old paper, but it's really quite an astounding piece of work.
And another astounding statistic is that most women with type 2 diabetes have at least diastolic heart failure. In other words, their heart muscle is stiff because the muscle that normally can do this and stretch has been replaced by fibroblasts. And so, yes, so fibroblasts are cells that produce collagen, and they don't produce muscle. And so it's stiffened the heart so that it can't distend properly. And a lot of women get diastolic heart failure, which is very similar to regular heart failure, also known as systolic heart failure, in that they get short of breath. They don't have the exercise tolerance that they used to have. Their heart will race. It'll trigger arrhythmias and palpitations. And that is a whole other aspect of how these things damage the heart, aside from causing arteriosclerosis, that I don't hear anybody talking about, the alteration in the cardiac tissue, the muscle tissue of your heart. It turns muscle cells into fiber cells that just don't contract. And they also don't conduce electricity very well either.
And fibrosis occurs in other aspects, other diseases that are associated to the metabolic syndrome, like in advanced liver disease. You get fibrotic lesions, osteoporosis, and osteoarthritis. You get an inability to remodel and an excess fibrosis generation. And the literature, again, I have a paper that explains exactly what's causing that, and it's a toxin that is produced in the body solely from seed oils. That's the cause of fibrosis. So this is another case where we have a crystal clear mechanism showing why this stuff is happening and what dietary element is driving it.
And you have to kind of do a little bit of stretch of the imagination to believe that insulin does all that stuff, but that is currently like the accepted explanation for cancer or heart failure or even arteriosclerosis, that insulin promotes oxidative stress. I've read that, and it doesn't make sense.
It does, and here's why. Insulin induces cells to take up oxidized lipoproteins, right? And what oxidizes in an oxidized lipoprotein are the N6 fats. So insulin is an intermediary in the process, but hyperinsulinemia is going to drive your body to try and dispose of all of these inflammatory fats. And, it's another pretty clear mechanism, and it leads to, prostate cancer. This is a major part of the mechanism of prostate cancer, that the CD36 fat transport protein is upregulated, and it starts hoovering up N6 fats. But as your
crazy
point you're getting to is in that model, there's no explanation for why are these people getting hyperinsulinemic, right? And whenever you're blaming something, you need to have an explanation for why it's causal. And I think we've got a pretty good explanation for why it's causal, but just saying, oh, the problem is hyperinsulinemia, you're not left with, well, I mean, certainly a low carbohydrate diet is going to improve that situation, but I don't think it's the ultimate cause. And you can still have problems with a high PUFA intake if you are on a low carb diet. So, ultimately, I think we want to try and understand, not make the mistake that the previous generations have made and point the finger too quickly without understanding what's going on.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, Dr. Cate's right. It's not the root cause. We were saying the root cause is the omega-6. Insulin's just doing its job, right? I think that's what Dr. Cate said. Insulin's doing its job. It stores energy, it does its thing, but it's not like, hey, insulin's the culprit.
And I want to be clear about the omega-6. It's the oxidative stress. It's not so much the eicosanoids, right? So people talk about omega-6 being anti-inflammatory and omega-6 being pro-inflammatory and omega-3 being anti-inflammatory. That's somewhat of an artificial dichotomy, but anyway, regardless of that, that is not the real problem. The real problem is that both of these degrade when exposed to oxygen, and particularly when the mitochondria tries to burn them, and they deteriorate into toxins like 4-hydroxynonenal, 4-hydroxyhexanol. Those are short-lived intermediates, and they degrade into things that are just like known to be toxic. So known to be toxic that like entire books have been written about their various toxic effects. This is coming from either omega-6 or omega-3 because these are the only fats that can react with oxygen at body temperature, right? So saturated fat and monounsaturated fat, they don't react with oxygen in and of themselves at body temperature in an uncontrolled way, right? So we want them to react with oxygen in the mitochondria, but in a very, very well-controlled way. And so it's not that they can't be, the issue is not so much the enzymatic generation of pro-inflammatory chemicals. It's really just that they're unstable. And omega-3 is more unstable than omega-6. And so you can actually, there's a study that Chris Ramsden at the National Institute of Health did on people who had migraine headaches. And he cured people of their migraine headaches simply by taking people off of seed oils. And he did not have to add any omega-3, but their blood levels of their omega-3 like doubled. Why? Because with less oxidative stress, you're getting less destruction of these highly unstable fatty acid types. So it's the oxidation of these things is extremely complex. And there's a lot of things that happen, and there's a lot of things that are not controlled for properly in the vast majority of human studies that I've seen. And they are the ones, these are the studies that are quoted by, the American Heart Association and all the figureheads in medicine who have to say that seed oils are healthy. And they quote these studies, but the studies are radically inadequate and they're flawed. They're just sheer garbage. No one should have to read them.
Except for masochists like us.
Yeah. So we can pick them apart. Make sure we're not wrong.
There's something important to understand, and it took me a while to get to the point where I knew enough reading these studies to understand that when people describe oxidative stress, the definition of that process is essentially oxidized omega-6 fats. Omega-3 fats oxidizing is also an issue, but it's a much smaller one in part because we just don't eat all that much of it. So that might be a factor if you're, an Inuit living on fish all the time. But typically when you read a paper and they're talking about oxidative stress, if you drill down enough, they're going to be measuring that process by measuring oxidized omega-6 fats like for hydroxynonenal, HNE, and MDA, which are coming from omega-6 fats. And once you start realizing that, then all of a sudden a light bulb will go on over your head when you start reading all of these papers, published in places like the AHA journals talking about the oxidative stress model of cardiovascular disease. And, you can follow that back to the roots, and lo and behold, they figured out that they can cause this by feeding people too much seed oils. Nevertheless, they continue to tell you to eat too much seed oils, despite what's published in the cardiovascular literature. So that's a key thing to understand about translating what they're talking about into actual mechanisms.
This is good because I talked with Dr. Cate about this before we started recording independently a while ago, and I want to let her talk about it. But just before we move on, before I thought, omega-3s are amazing. You got to take omega-3 and all that. And now I realize that they are unstable. They are not good in excess probably, and they can still, break down and cause this oxidation. So I don't think it's great.
They are much less toxic.
Less toxic, but maybe you shouldn't be guzzling pills, like fish oil pills.
Right.
Yeah. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And then, there could be, but luckily, no one's eating them in anywhere near the amounts that we're eating these seed oils. Seed oils are in everything. Just in case this is your first time listening to this podcast, I mean, every packaged food has basically some seed oils in it. And why people find success in going low carb a lot is because they're just getting rid of all those seed oils just by accident. But I want to let Dr. Cate talk about the AHA. I'm glad you brought that up, and then why we have a lot of this bad research. And because some people say we didn't get to the part yet about how we're going to break down some of the counter arguments against these seed oils, and part of them are pushed by the Harvard School of Public Health and Mozaffarian and like these big people, and we're just, people want to know why. People listening are like, what I heard that my doctor said they're okay, or there's these studies that said they're okay. So you kind of need to trace back some roots to why do we have these studies that purport to say that they're okay?
Yeah, so there's one reason, because Ansel Keys wanted to make the American Heart Association, they wanted to put it on the map, and they needed an infusion of $1.7 million from Procter & Gamble that makes hydrogenated vegetable oil. The product was Crisco. And so he had to, in order to make that happen, and in order to get his hypothesis that saturated fat was the problem, or really just like fat in general was the problem, he was kind of really muddy on that. It was, he kind of went back and forth, like, it was total fat or is it saturated fat? Finally, he settled on saturated fat. But that begun a relationship that continues to this day between the American Heart Association and the seed oil industry. And that's why there are, the American Heart Association educates doctors. They have a dozen journals and they pump out article after article. Just, it's a propaganda machine saying just how great seed oils are. There's a gentleman, I was on Bill Maher about 6 months ago, saying that seed oils suck. And to correct the record, I think he got a phone call from somebody, and they had Mozaffarian on 3 weeks later saying that, we have an obesity epidemic because we just are too lazy and we eat too much. We need to eat more fruits and vegetables. He didn't mention the seed oils, but his website, of course, he says, we need to be eating more of them and less saturated fat. But
yeah, and if you want to understand Mozaffarian, go find some of his papers and read who funds them.
There you go.
Funded by the seed oil industry. So, which is just a fascinating conflict of interest. What's the big European seed oil company that sold?
I don't know.
Unilever.
Oh.
So he was funded by Unilever, and at the same time, Unilever is paying him to produce pro seed oil, in my opinion, research. They're selling their seed oil business. And what I've heard is they're selling it because the seed oil industry recognizes the problems with their product, right? That's easily demonstrable by the fact that they have been reformulating their products to get rid of the omega fats for years. Right? There are all sorts of problems. If you want to know the best place to go to find out about the problems of omega-6 fats is to go read the seed oil literature, because that's where they talk about toxins that are produced when you heat these things, right? We've got the Harvard School of Health, where apparently the left hand doesn't know what he's doing, where they publish research saying that seed oils are fine, and then they publish research saying that fried foods will give you cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Well, what on earth are these things fried in? They're fried in seed oils, right? And the literature, the oil industry literature is perfectly clear about what happens to these things when you fry them. They turn into HNA, they turn into toxins, and that's readily taken up in your body. So it's just, sorry if I'm getting a little exasperated here, but there are few instances of flagrant corruption in medicine, but the pumping the seed oils, as the manufacturers of the seed oils are desperately trying to get out of the business and desperately trying to reformat their products so that they're not harmful anymore, while publishing papers about how harmful they are. It's infuriating. That is, by the way, a rather helpful note, is they are trying to make their product less harmful. The high versions of a lot of these seed oils that are produced are definitely a better thing than the older traditional version. So we have to give them credit for doing that. But much like, Philip Morris would never come out and say, oh, we're trying to produce a healthier cigarette, because then they'd have to admit that it's an unhealthy cigarette. But that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to make a healthier seed oil, which is, I guess, a good thing for humanity, even if, it would be nice if they were a little, my favorite industry, my favorite industry headline was something on the order of Plenish, a GMO soybean oil, is less obesogenic than regular soybean oil.
Mm-hmm.
Less obesogenic. It's lower N6, so it is less obesogenic, okay? Unfortunately, they compared it to, and they hired a researcher who had done the first paper showing that soybean oil was obesogenic to do this comparison. They compared it to coconut oil, which isn't obesogenic at all. This is the industry's opinion on these things, not mine, right? So if you go to the supermarket and you're looking at what you should eat, go for the coconut oil, regardless of what the AHA says or regardless of what the Harvard School of Public Health says, because the industry tells you that it's not obesogenic. They know it.
Yeah.
Yeah, what they will never do, what the Mosafarians, and by the way, there's a Mosafarian, so he's at Tufts, but there's a Mosafarian at Harvard. He has a different name. There's another Mosafarian at Yale. It's a different name. What?
I think he used to be at Harvard. He was, and then he moved.
Yes, he's now at Tufts. Yeah, and so, but he's not a doctor. He is a spin doctor, and he's got a license to lie about butter and cheese and eggs, and a mandate to make us buy more seed oils, right? It's not just, this is if he stops doing this, then he gets bounced out of that ivory tower faster than you can say egg white omelet. And, if he ever promotes saturated fat, he loses his job.
But it's worse than that. He's a cardiologist.
Oh, yeah.
And
he's one of many.
The model for what causes heart disease is seed oils, right? That's the model that the cardiology profession has produced. And they deny it as bad as they can. But if you start reading the papers and going back, when they tried to show that LDL was bad for you, they failed. Okay.
Right.
Brown and Goldstein, after they got the Nobel Prize for discovering the LDL receptor, the first thing they tried to do was show that LDL was harmful, and they failed. And then Steinberg and Whitstone came up and said, oh, look, we can make harmful LDL. All we have to do is feed people seed oils. Bingo! I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And then Steinberg turned around and convinced Merck to lower or to introduce statins. So once you understand that a statin is the solution to the problem of seed oil consumption, all of a sudden, all these lights should start going off above your head. Wait a minute, I get it. But then a cardiologist like Mosafarian, doesn't he know this? He was at Harvard and now he's at Tufts, for heaven's sakes. Surely he knows that the model that they have in their profession is that seed oils cause heart disease. That's why they do what they do.
Well, he was at the low carb conference in 2018, and he said seed oils have never been proven to be unhealthy There's nothing unhealthy about them. And he's completely ignoring all of food science, where there's entire industries built around trying to prevent these things from oxidizing, because now that we can't have saturated fat, we have to have these seed oils. And now that we can't have trans fat, which were more stable, believe it or not, and better for us than the highly oxidizable seed oils. So
Peter at the blog Hyperlipid, I won't pronounce his last name because I can't, had one of the best papers, or one of the best blog posts I've ever seen about a paper that compared trans fats to seed oils and found that trans fats were actually better for you than seed oils, in an animal model, of course. But nobody had ever done a study comparing the two. And his comment was, so if you're a public health official and you have to ban a fat, which fat are you going to ban? The wrong one.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real moral crisis in medicine because it just simply hasn't figured out how to make money off of keeping people healthy. But we have really got it nailed in terms of how to make money off of people who are just chronically ill. And that's the important thing to understand. The character of these people, I think, is important to understand, because, the average person listening is going to be like, well, my doctor says, and he says Harvard, blah, blah, blah. You've got to know who you're talking to when you go see your doctor. And if your doctor is just parroting Harvard or parroting, the American Heart Association because he doesn't have time and he's too busy, it's not like he's evil or bad or lazy. We get educated on the wrong things. But he's just saying something opposite of what seems to make a little bit of sense. And from reading your blog or my books or any of the keto stuff, right, or the Peak Human, any of it, they're going to be like, okay, but my doctor says something different. And I trust my doctor. He helped me with my ear infection, right? It can't be that bad. But it's this one area where doctors are used as tools of keeping the system large and making sure people do not get the most powerful information they deserve to stay healthy, which is just how to eat a decent human diet.
Yep.
It's obvious too. Well, okay, go Tucker.
No, I was going to say, so, clearly, Dr. Cate and I are singing from the same songbook here. We should probably get into some of the counter arguments, because I really, frankly, enjoy the counter arguments and comparing their claims to what the literature actually says. Because so the last time the podcast that Brian referenced before was 2.5 hours long, something terrible like that. I mean, if you go back and you listen to the whole thing, I really give you kudos. But one guy, and I can't remember his name right now, and I apologize to him, he went back and he fact-checked every claim that I made in this long podcast. And then
Joe, yeah.
That was Joe,
Wow.
Yeah. And there's
Super fan.
do it on the episode 20.
Joe Kalb. I think it's Joe Kalb. He did a write-up.
So he did a write-up, and you linked to the write-up, and it's well worth reading. I've linked to it on my blog as well. But everything that Dr. Cate has said and everything that I am saying here can be referenced in the scientific and medical literature. We're not going out on a limb here, right? So let's address some of the criticisms, and then we can contrast that to what the science actually says.
Yeah, perfect idea, perfect transition. And yeah, we said we were going to do that because there are people trying to do the science. So we've got to talk about what's wrong with that science. And Dr. Cate started talking about the higher level. What's wrong with it is it's funded by the wrong people, and there's this huge business, and there's conflict of interest, and these people need to keep their jobs. Luckily, my job, I don't have an employer, and I can change my mind, and I can go, and it doesn't matter. If sugar's okay, I'll talk about how sugar's okay, right? It's like, I was wrong. But these guys can't do that.
Google doesn't decide to shut you down.
Well, yeah. But these guys can't do that. So it makes sense. But then let's get deeper into why. And yeah, so what are people saying? What studies are they using to try to show that N6 is okay?
Well, so you sent out this article from
blog post.
Alinea Nutrition, is it? I don't know how to say this. Alinea Nutrition, which is, I guess, this guy in Ireland who's a PhD student or something. And I guess you'll put a link to this in the
Yeah.
podcast notes. The title is of rats in Sydney diet heart, drawing a line under polyunsaturated pseudoscience, where he attempts to make the claim that this is all baloney, and he goes through a bunch of papers, including some of the people we've talked about already on this discussion. So, okay, this is going to be a little exhausting, but I'll try and hit the high points here, right? So, to say that hysteria about the health effects of polyunsaturated fats, PUFA, has reached fever pitch may be an understatement. Okay, so he starts with a straw man, right? Nobody, as Dr. Cate and I have both been clear, the problem is excess consumption. PUFA is not a problem. It's a natural part of the diet. Your body needs it. Nobody's claiming it. So this article in its first sentence starts with a straw man argument, right? A straw man argument is when you make a bogus argument that nobody's actually making, and then you argue against that. And it's really fun because it's really easy to argue against an imaginary bogus claim that you say people are making, because you can make it as ridiculous as you want. So for starters, and I've gotten this, several people have asked my opinion on this, including Stan Efferding. Stan, I apologize for not getting around to it, but I was moving out to Idaho and I was otherwise preoccupied. So hopefully he can point people to this discussion. And I guess Stan sent it to you too, Brian. Yeah. So, okay, so he starts off with a straw man argument, and then he goes into, this is, I think, my favorite part of the paper. He says, the surge of popularity of ancestral viewpoints of health and the popularity of paleo diets and other arguments based on evolution and natural fats, which apparently means saturated animal fat, right? And he goes on about how these crazy cavemen paleo types are making all of these arguments about fats that are unjustified based on what we have in the scientific literature. I'm one of those crazy paleo caveman types, I will confess. I also run barefoot, so I've bought into the whole thing. Okay, so God, I run barefoot. I've run barefoot with Dan Lieberman, who's the professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard. So that's how much of a crazy idea barefoot running is. Anyway, so then he offers up this citation that saturated fats were estimated to have provided about 6% of the average total energy intake. This is his refutation to the paleo movement, okay? Who wrote this paper? Boyd Eaton. S. Boyd Eaton. Who is S. Boyd Eaton? He's the founder of the paleo diet movement. He's the guy who came up with this whole thing. And it's interesting. This is a good study. Dan Lieberman cited this study in his book, The Story of the Human Body, how our transition from a Paleolithic style diet into a modern diet caused all these diseases. So it's a great paper, but it's one of the founding papers of the paleo diet movement. So he's starting off with a straw man, and then he's promptly moving into misciting the scientific literature. So, okay, his credibility's in the toilet, and I haven't even gotten into the 6th paragraph yet. So then he goes on, and he talks about the shoreline hypothesis, which is an interesting one from Stephen Kinane. But again, it's just a hypothesis. It's certainly not.
It's neither here nor there, really.
It's neither here nor there. And Kinane makes lots of really good points, which everybody in the paleo diet world would agree with, that getting adequate PUFA in your diet is important. There are other explanations about how you could do it, But he starts off by claiming the paleo diet is bogus, citing the founder of the paleo diet to show it, and then coming up with this completely hypothetical, very controversial, very non-standard explanation for human health by Stephen Kinane, who's a very smart guy and one whose research I like. everybody can come up with something that's controversial. There's nothing wrong with that. But this is not an argument. Okay, so then he claims section 2, ability to find rodent studies to corroborate beliefs about PUFA, and he says to say nothing of their lack of translational evidence in humans. Okay, so I already discussed Brown and Goldstein and trying to prove that LDL was harmful and failing to prove that LDL induces foam cells, which is the first step of atherosclerosis. And then Steinberg and Whitstone coming up with, oh, look, it's seed oils that are causing this. Well, the first thing that they did, they tested it in a rabbit model, okay? And then they turned around and they tested it in a human model. This was in 1989. This is ancient evidence, right? I mean, I discussed the TPN data of the harms of omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. They've been working on for decades, and they've got a FDA approval. The FDA has conceded effectively that N6 soybean oil is harmful when it's infused into a human, and that seed oils are not, right? So we go from this straw man to just being completely unfamiliar with the existing evidence that's decades old, translating this into human research and human health research, and into things that have been approved by the FDA for treatment of human children. I mean, okay, so great. Now, that's the end of section 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I could spend the rest of the day going through this thing, but this guy is a classic example of somebody who thinks he's educated on a topic, going through and trying to critique it and just frankly making a fool out of himself.
There's a lot of ad hominem attacks in there and non sequiturs.
Well, he doesn't have the facts. The old comment about, if you're a lawyer, argue the law. If you don't have the law, argue the facts. And if you don't have either, pound the table. All you do is pound the table.
That's funny. Well, and Dr. Cate, did you have a specific study you wanted to bring up from it?
Yeah, I do. So the study that is Sodergren et al. 2001. So I'll just read. It was a free living study, so people were not like in a hospital or a metabolic ward or anything. There were 19 healthy adults, and some of them the study lasted 4 weeks. Some of the folks in the study had a rapeseed oil rich diet, which is high, it's canola, so it's high polyunsaturated fat and higher in omega-3 than omega-6. And then a higher in saturated fat diet. And it says the study used reliable measures of in vivo oxidative stress. Now, there are so many different types of markers of oxidative stress that are reliable. They're just very short-lived. And it depends on a lot of details about what else is in the diet, iron levels, oxygen, levels in different tissues. So anyway, what he says is there were no significant differences in markers of oxidative stress or lipid peroxidation, those are two important things, in either of the two diets. Now, I looked at the table he's talking about, the markers of oxidative stress, and it's very interesting. So there's two things here. So the baseline diet had higher markers of oxidative stress than either of the two study diets. No mention about that. And I suppose it's so dramatically different that it looks like it would reach statistical significance. But there was a difference. It didn't have the p-value that you need. So that means that you need to comment on that and say, well, this study was underpowered, or it needed to go on longer.
Well,
more people.
Note quickly that the statisticians are desperately trying to get the medical community to stop using p-values because they don't have the meaning that they assign to them, right? It doesn't mean there's no effect. It just means the effect doesn't reach some arbitrary statistical boundary. So
they get to not mention it, right? So they get to lie about it, say there was no difference, but there was a clear difference.
Right, exactly correct.
And so the other interesting and very important thing here is that the amount of PUFA in the baseline diet is probably higher than the amount of PUFA in the so-called high PUFA diet. And that's kind of key, because if your population is consuming, say, 20 to 30%, maybe 50% of their fats from PUFA, and your so-called high PUFA study arm has 15%, then you're not going to see the kinds of things that you think you're going to see comparing the baseline to the study diet, which is, what you look at here, but they didn't report on it. So there's all kinds of funny things happening. And then another thing is these seed oils build up in our body fat over decades, right? How long do they stay there? How long until your diet, maybe you cut out seed oils down to a reasonable level, 2-5%, or your PUFAs down to a reasonable level, your body fat is still loaded up with that stuff, and it's going to be for years. So a 4-week study does not begin to scratch the surface of the duration of time that you would really want to reasonably look at this. So I'm not surprised that the results weren't overwhelming, but the results were exactly what you would predict if you understand that seed oils promote oxidative stress. There was more oxidative stress in the rapeseed oil diet than there was in the saturated fat diet by every measure. There were 6 measures by every measure, except for one, and I'm not sure exactly I even understand what that last measure was. But so there you go. I mean, the results are exactly what you'd expect. You just want to have a higher power, a better study, right? It's got to go on for longer, and you've got to acknowledge that your study diet, that's supposedly high PUFA, is actually lower than what they were doing in the beginning, as evidenced by the fact that all of these markers went down in the high PUFA group. So that's just, one of the kinds of examples, right? So people can cite this stuff, but they have to understand that once you step into the ring with seed oils and you start talking oxidation, you really need to understand what the molecules look like. You ought to be able to draw them. You ought to be able to describe a process called basophilic attack. And you ought to know a lot more than I bet this bro science dude here really has bothered looking at.
Right. The other interesting study that he looks at in this is in section 3, which I didn't get to in my little rant before. He says, this also tends to run in with the, quote, it all started with Ansel Keys' diatribe regurgitated by automatons who haven't even read his research or even of the wider diet heart literature. Then he insults Christopher Ramsden, who did a reassessment of a study called the Minnesota coronary experiment. He never does mention that the fellow who ran the Minnesota coronary experiment was in fact Ansel Keys, as he goes and criticizes it for being poor methodological construction, while ignoring the fact that Keys started the MCE he had previously done an epidemiological examination of the issue of saturated fat and heart disease called the 7-country experiment, where he was criticized because it was epidemiology. So he said, okay, we'll round up a bunch of people and we will feed them saturated fat and they will all die and I will be famous forever. Okay. So what happened with that little study? Well, it turns out that when they fed them lots of seed oils, they tended to be more likely to die than the saturated fat wing. Okay. But Keys didn't publish that result. He buried the result because it would have crucified his reputation if everybody realized, oops, what he's been telling us to do for the last several decades is actually making people sicker. So they never published those results. They published the results that say that seed oils lower cholesterol, which they do, but which doesn't seem to help you if, Ramsden went and looked at 2 different studies, Sydney Diet Heart and the MCE, to show that both studies came to the same conclusion, that increasing PUFA feeding led to higher coronary disease. Now, this guy goes through and starts, despite earlier defending Ansel Keys, he now starts slandering the poor guy by criticizing his study design, even though his study design at the time was the best that was possible and was done to refute all the criticisms of his previous epidemiology. This was an actual human RCT, an interventional study, right? And his major criticism of this study is that, and this really gets down to the quality of these critiques. His major criticism of the study was that they were not all inpatient for the entire duration of the study. Okay, that sounds good.
Most studies don't even have
That sounds
inpatient.
good unless you know anything about dietary research. But don't take my word for this. Kevin Hall, who is a researcher at the NIH, who is somewhat controversial, but does these metabolic ward studies, right? But his are only 2 weeks long because they're so expensive to do that you can't do anything more than a small study for 2 weeks. Every single dietary study that's ever been done that tried to be interventional was outpatient. So to claim that MCE is no good because they're not an inpatient study is basically like, I don't even know. It's such a ridiculous criticism. It's basically fine. If you want to critique all of dietary research as invalid because it wasn't inpatient, great, you can do that. But you can't turn around and say, well, I like this one because that was outpatient too, because they're all outpatient. Because anything more than 2 weeks has to be outpatient because you can't afford to do it. I mean, the Women's Health Initiative, that was all outpatient. The Nurses' Health Study, all outpatient. All of this stuff was done this way. So the fact that it's just a totally bogus critique. It's a completely bogus critique of this study, all because, and then he turns around and he says, well, we have to look at the real evidence. There's a hierarchy of evidence in medicine, or at least there's supposed to be. And at the top of it is the human interventional study, right? But the first thing he does is ignore the evidence of fraud in Sydney Diet Health and in the MCE, that they came up with a result they didn't like and hid it. And this guy, Ramsden, had to go find it in a dusty basement of one of the lead researchers' sons who had saved all the boxes of evidence, right? And publish it. Oh, look, seed oils are bad for you. So then the next thing this fellow does is he turns around and says, well, let's look at the worst evidence, okay? Now we've got the best level of evidence, which is human RCTs. And then he starts talking about epidemiology and some other nonsense. I could
It's
go
tough.
on. I mean,
Yeah,
I have yet to be able to read this. I will confess, I have yet to be able to read this all the way through because it is just almost every sentence contains something that's just laughable and unscientific and just absurd, absurd.
When you talk about human intervention studies, I know it's not a randomized controlled trial, but we are in the midst of the biggest human intervention study ever perpetrated on the human race. By the very fact, it's a de facto, we are consuming more seed oils than anyone ever before in history. And look what's happening. I mean, I know you can say there's also other things, right? Like
Wait, we're all thin and lean and healthy, aren't we? That was the goal.
Right. I mean, we have kids that have had complications of their type 2 diabetes, including strokes and heart attacks, age 3. I mean, that was unheard of when I was in medical school.
Yes. Well, I don't know if you're old enough, but they had to redefine all these diseases because type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes.
Yeah.
They had to change the name because then so many kids started getting it all of a sudden. And there are other diseases like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that didn't exist 50, 60 years ago. Or my favorite crazy example is the ACL tear was a rare thing in the 1960s. And now like 15, 20% of kids get them. I mean, we're falling apart. Whatever
Yeah, we are. Our physiology is.
It's not working very well.
No, I mean, it is it's an existential threat because we are just becoming so unhealthy that we might not be able to have people who can join the military or do the type of hard labor jobs that most countries need. I mean, right now we have most of that happening thanks to people who are willing to import themselves into this country and do hard physical labor. But I was in Hawaii and I noticed that that my patients who were in their 60s were in pretty fantastic shape. They could work and they could work all day, every day, cleaning, hotels. It's a hard job. It's a labor intensive job. And the human resources, it caught the eye of the human resources person that the younger generation couldn't do that. And his idea was, oh, well, they just don't have the ethic. But my idea was they don't have the physiology to do it. And then when I moved from Hawaii to the States, to New Hampshire, I was shocked. I mean, I had been off the mainland for 10 years, and the decline in health that I witnessed going from Hawaii to there, it was just, I did not see it coming. Like, there were people, and many people in their 20s and 30s that had medical charts. Like, they had so many procedures. Nobody really knew what was wrong with them. They certainly all had diabetes and obesity and different kinds of chronic pain, but they were on disability. And like, the amount of disability, that was 2011, and it's just getting worse. And I deal with it every day. I mean, these are people who are in physical pain on a daily basis because we have Ansel Keys, who wanted to promote his idea that saturated fat was the cause of heart disease, so he could be on the cover of Time magazine. I wish he quit after that, because then we could at least have a real conversation around nutrition. We wouldn't be, sustaining this lie that he created 50, 60, 70 years ago, when it's just continuing to lead. I mean, as far as like war crimes, why isn't that a war crime? We have human suffering. We have unconsensual experimentation on the human race. Why isn't that, like, at that level? Why isn't somebody somebody in the ethical space here? Forget about medicine. Just like
Dr. Cate's making a really important point here, but I think you're assuming a little too much familiarity with study design when you're making this claim. But it's a really important point, and I want to just explode it a little, flesh it out a little bit. So it's a fundamental principle of research that if you're doing a study on somebody, an experiment on somebody, that they have to know what's going to happen to them, right? What are the side effects that can be expected, and they can leave whenever they want to, right? That's the fundamental thing. I mean, the studies that were done were what was this, the syphilis experiment, where African Americans were infected with syphilis and not told, so that they could be examined to see what would happen to them. I mean, that was appalling. And then there's, Dr. Mengele, the Nazi doctor who experimented on Jewish prisoners and did horrible things. So they have this basic principle in medical research that you're, supposed to be okay. You can leave. You can walk out the door whenever you want to. You can stop taking the pills, unless you're an American citizen and you're following the dietary guidelines. In that case, there's nowhere you can go. You're not allowed to not leave it, right? It's just, they imposed this thing on us. It was said to be an experiment at the time. And, obviously one can walk around the country or watch a couple of movies, as I described before, and realize that it's going poorly. It's not ended the obesity epidemic as it was supposed to, back on an era where we look at the people when the dietary guidelines were introduced and nobody thinks they're even fat.
We'd be lucky to go back then.
Yeah, exactly. If we could roll the clock back to 1979 when they put in the dietary guidelines, we'd be so much better off than we are nowadays. But that's her fundamental point, that they're doing this experiment and we're not informed of the experiment. We're not allowed to comment on it. I have a great document from the food industry saying that an important part of making this change in diet is being dishonest. Stealth, they call it, right? Don't tell people what you're doing because they'll object to it, right? I mean, it's so unethical. It's unbelievably unethical. And yes, history books, when they're talking, history books hopefully will look back on this experiment as they look back now on the Tallahassee syphilis experiment. Tuskegee, thank you. It's a black mark. It's a huge black mark on medicine that it's gone along with this. And if you go back and you read the debates in the Senate over implementing this, the hearings that they had, there was no question that this was controversial and that there were lots of people who objected to it, thought it was unfounded, thought it wasn't scientifically justified. There was no research that was ever done to support it. It was just imposed.
But they thought, what's the worst that can happen? There was some quote, they're like, we could just eat less fat, but what's the worst that can happen? And
Well,
they had
now we
no
know.
idea. Yeah.
Well, they also reordered the entire food chain, right? Like we used to have small farms and cows were fed on grass, and now we have all this monoculture corn, soy, canola, and that too is on it's on the head of all of these doctors, including Etzl and the Mosiferians of the world, who are just they're science deniers, and now we have we have this potential, if it's true, to use animals to help put more carbon in the soil by the regenerative farming that I'm sure you guys have talked about before. We put more carbon, so much carbon back in the soil using animals and these regenerative processes that we could roll back the carbon in the atmosphere to the 1800s, like pre-industrial level. I mean, if that's even halfway true, and we're not jumping on that. Instead, what we're doing is we're going to say, okay, well, we're going to upload our brains to robots, and then we're going to fly to Mars because we've just, because we've got this whole science thing just down. We can do things like that. We can't even feed ourselves. We can't even create a healthy food chain right now. And, but to me, it all comes back to the lie about saturated fat, because without that, you couldn't take away any of the animal products. You couldn't take away the traditional farming techniques. You couldn't push for the monoculture cropping the way that we have that destroys the soil. So it all comes down to that one lie. And by the way, the 7-country study published by Ansel Keys between the 50s and the 80s, I mean, it was a huge ongoing study. He collected cigarette smoking data that he never published. And that was the real smoking gun, pun intended, for the link between lifestyle and heart attacks. It was smoking all along.
Yes. Yes.
He had that.
I've not looked into it, but you know what's very educational? If you go back and you read the final report of the 7 countries study, Keys was not a co-author on that one, and they basically throw in the towel because they had this big confounder that they found, the Japanese, who had no relationship between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. And they even say it's unlikely that any of this stuff is going to be fixed by the dietary intake, by the dietary adjustments. So as far as I'm concerned, it was a failed study. And I think Keys knew it was a failed study. That's why he wasn't a co-author on the final paper. And it's why he turned around and did the MCE, which put the nail in the coffin of the whole saturated fat hypothesis. And if he had been an honest person and had published the actual results instead of hiding them, we would have known that.
Absolutely.
It's so big. And yeah, I was talking to Kate beforehand too, that Ansel Keys knew about the smoking and purposely didn't bring it up. And it's a big lie. My film's called Food Lies. The big lie. This is the big lie that started everything. And it was so convenient for the food industry and everything else that happened after that to perpetuate it. People always ask me why, this is not, my doctor said this, or why isn't this mainstream news? I sound like a crackpot conspiracy theorist saying that beef is okay and saturated fat is okay. I'm saying this is why. There was the big lie. The studies covered up. There's evidence of all this. We'll put in the film. Also want to mention Nina Teicholz. A lot of this stuff we're talking about, she kind of put it together in her book, The Big Fat Surprise, and talking about the studies that were buried and all this stuff. So it's all there, that there's all the evidence is there that this happened. There was the big lie. It wasn't just some kind of accident. Ansel Keys was trying to make a name for himself. He was covering up other data. I mean, he didn't know this was all going to happen, I'm sure. But, there just is some sort of more things going on that big interests, the American Heart Association we talked about, all kinds of big stuff that are perpetuating this. But
we could do a whole nother podcast on, so we looked at this Align Nutrition Fellows article. We could do a whole other thing on the AHA Presidential Advisory on PUFA intake that came out a couple of years ago, because they just wholesale lie in that study about, the most egregious thing that I saw them do is exclude a bunch of studies that showed a negative effect of N6 intake on cardiovascular disease, and their rationale for excluding those studies was that they didn't last long enough. They didn't last 2 years because it took 2 years for an effect to be seen, and they provide a reference. So I was like, 2 years? I've never heard this. So I went and read the reference, and the reference said the effects were within 2 weeks. So they literally made up a lie, provided a couple of bogus references, one of which had nothing to do with it, and the other of which completely refuted that claim. And that was their excuse for excluding the studies that showed harm from N6 fats. It's outrageous.
It's outrageous. I mean, it makes my profession look like a huge embarrassment. I mean, we're just parroting stuff, and we do care about our patients, but we don't have the time really to dig through all this stuff that you and I've been talking about. We don't have the training, in organic chemistry to really understand what's a lie, and certainly don't have the training in statistics, which is the most powerful weapon of obfuscation I think that they have. I mean, just controlling for other variables. You can hide anything in that, right?
I'd like to talk to that a little bit because I'm super critical of the medical profession. I mean, just on seed oils, when seed oils were introduced, it was the 1800s, right? They thought genuinely that they had taken cottonseed oil, which was toxic, and detoxified it, right? Seed oils are not acutely toxic at the levels that were consumed at that point. So they genuinely thought that they were doing something that was beneficial. And the most compelling research that's been done on the toxicity of seed oils really only on the mechanisms really only started coming out in the late 1980s and the 1990s. I mean, one of the most interesting papers that I've seen showing, Dr. Cate mentioned my obsession with cardiolipin before. This paper showed that cardiolipin breaks down into toxins in the mitochondria. That came out in 2011. So that was not all that long ago. So medicine's really good. I mean, if you need trauma care, if you're in a car accident, go see a doctor. They're just really bad at chronic diseases, and they need ideally to just admit it.
Right. They could be really good if they would just, do what we say, which is basically cut out the seed oils. That's all you need. And there's so many people who have written books. There's so many websites that can give people support. You don't really need to have like a full cadre of nutritionists and dietitians in your office. And there's some fantastic low carb doctors that they get it too about the seed oils. And they support people quickly, but they just say, here, look, you're good. You're going to be good. Your saturated fat, eat your saturated fat. Your LDL's going up. That's okay. LDL's good. There's no such thing as bad cholesterol. If you're worried, I'll do these other tests. We can figure out if there's inflammation going on. But, it's where I feel like we're just like 1 inch away from doctors waking up,
and
a few more.
The best, I mean, as much as medical science pretends not to like anecdotes, what's really going to compel doctors is anecdotes of other doctors fixing their health. I mean, that's why like Trocalagian, who's a bit of an inflammatory figure himself, but it's so compelling because he was morbidly obese and he did fix it so fast. And he is turning around and doing that to his patient. And, I've got a couple of other examples. Thomas Dayspring, of all people, the statin promoter, Dr. LDL, he likes to call himself, came out and admitted that he was overweight. And I think it was Peter Attia guided him on how to fix. Peter Attia promotes pretty much a paleo diet with too many medications, in my opinion, but gets that part of it, right? Because he fixed himself. And, when you see before and after, I mean,
over and over.
But yeah, I mean,
and you feel it yourself. Like there's a cardiologist who I think is a real hero, Dr. Nadir Ali.
Yes.
Or Ali Nadir.
Nadir Ali, yeah.
I had the pleasure of eating dinner with him at a keto thing up in Connecticut. Super nice.
Oh, wow. I would love to meet him one day. But he was an interventional, for people who don't know him, he was an interventional cardiologist, the folks who put stents in hearts. And he got so jaded about giving people dietary advice that he stopped. He said, just, I don't want to talk to them. Just when they come into the cath lab, I'll put a stent in their heart. And then he learned about healthy saturated fats and the harms of seed oils and a lot of stuff about carbs and insulin that he's into. But he like changed. I mean, this is a person who was the pinnacle of medicine that makes money off of this bad diet. That's interventional cardiologist. And he changed. He's telling people now to, you don't need a stent, just change your diet. I mean, that's like Jesus level of, of doing good.
And
It's great.
And to your point about how little of a change you need, so right here is a picture, an old picture of my fiance, and we knew each other in high school. We got back together almost 2 years ago now, and we had dinner together, and she walked in, and she was quite a bit heavier than the last time I had seen her, and she's the first one to admit that. So I hope she won't kill me for saying that, but she was a vegan, a Dr. Grieger vegan, near vegan, not completely vegan, and quite sick, 56 pounds overweight. And I had my normal reaction to a vegan, which is, oh Lord. But she asked me what I was doing, because, this is what always happens to me when I go out to dinner with people is, I'm acutely gluten intolerant, so I've got to have this negotiation with the waiter on what I can eat. And all I had was sausages and nothing else and no vegetables. So she started asking me, and I told her basically a sentence. She said, what should I do? And I said, avoid seed oils, refine carbohydrates, and make sure that you eat lots of animal protein and animal fats. Right? It was a sentence. Because she was a vegan. I figured she wouldn't do it. I wanted to say as little as possible because I didn't want to get into an argument with a vegan. So a couple of weeks later, she calls me up and she says, okay, so I'm doing what you told me to do, and I've lost 17 pounds so far. And she wound up down 56 pounds in 2.5 months, back to her high school weight, basically.
Wow.
And put her fibromyalgia that she'd had for decades completely into remission. She hasn't had any pain from fibromyalgia for, over probably 1.5 years now. That was a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And she just listened and did it.
Not everyone can do that without help.
No, not everyone can do that. But the point is, it can be really simple. It can be really simple.
And then the battle begins with your doctor, though, if they look at your LDL and they say, oh gosh, your LDL is over 200, your total cholesterol is over 300. Even though you lost weight, your blood pressure is better, you feel better, every other marker is better. That LDL, I don't know, we might need to put you on a drug.
She's lucky. She's a low LDL person still.
Oh, yeah. So there's like a good portion of people who, they get to that point where it's now they have to decide between, they really have to make a tough decision because they get nervous. And that's why I put more information in the book, like the Fat Burn Fix,
right.
so that people can be like, okay, well.
For anybody who's in that situation, Dave Feldman is a great resource on how to cope with that. I don't know, maybe we can put something about him in the show notes. When I went through this process 10 years ago, when I fixed my diet, I went into my doctor and told him I was switching to a high-fat diet, and he nearly had a stroke sitting right there at his desk, and he said, I don't agree with that. And I said, well, that's why I'm here telling you this, doctor. I want you to run the tests, and if I'm killing myself, you can tell me. So he was fine, but by that point, this blew my mind. By that point, I knew more about what tests to run than he did. And I told him to do an NMR lipoprotein test because my cholesterol, on a family basis, my father had about the same cholesterol that I do, which was, 256, not crazy high, but high by medical standards. But if you looked at the NMR lipoprotein tests, I was off the bottom of the risk charts. So my LDL was a bit high, my total cholesterol was a bit high, but when you looked at all the subfractions, I was below the bottom of the risk parameters. And he looked at all the data, and he looked at what happened to my, insulin. I was pre-diabetic also, and he said, you're going to live to 100. Everything,
Nice.
And he was open-minded and willing to look at the
Great.
evidence and understand what I was telling him.
Yeah, great. I mean, you communicated obviously very clearly to him, and that's a good doctor. They listen to their patients. That's all it takes. You can learn so much just by listening.
That is. I've never heard such a good doctor that just could actually listen to that so quickly. But
Well, it was even better than that, because my father wound up going to him years later, and he was pretty sick at that point with heart failure. And we sat down I sat down with my dad and the doctor, who I had ceased seeing because I don't need to see a doctor anymore. And my dad said, "Well, what should I eat, doctor?" And he looked at me and he said, "You should eat whatever your son tells you to."
There you go.
wow,
That's an endorsement.
I love it. I love it. And to go back to this big experiment that we're all in, the only people that go outside the experiment are these rogue, crazy people like us. So I'll just throw that in there, that it is possible to go outside the experiment. It's really hard because you have to go against doctor's orders, you have to go against friends and family, you have to go against everyone. But you
have to
can
look
do
at
it.
tiny ingredients. You have to look at all the ingredients and everything you buy too. That's hard.
It's a pain.
Not easy. Yeah, you have to go to a restaurant and, be difficult and say, "Oh, I don't want this," maybe, like Tucker is saying, you have to.
Although I will say,
So,
it's far easier now than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was just people are like, "What's gluten?" And now, I regularly go to restaurants and I say that to the server, and the server's like, "Oh, I'm celiac. I know exactly what you need."
yeah. Well, that too, or just a seed oil. I actually do remember on my last interview with Dr. Cate saying, maybe you should just tell people you're seed oil intolerant. If you go out to restaurants, I mean, that's a good rule of thumb. If you just, or even just pretend you're seed oil intolerant, because you probably are, as this whole podcast laid out,
Human.
then it's like, oh, well, I can't eat this because it has seed oils. I can't eat this. I can't eat. So you go to the store, you can't buy anything except for the fresh food around the edges. You go to a restaurant, you tell them that, and then they'll give you something that isn't cooked in seed oil. So it's a good practice to just say you're seed oil intolerant, which probably everyone is, because we shouldn't be eating them in these high amounts at least. So, man,
And
yeah.
I mean, most places, certainly restaurants are they get a lot of this nowadays, so they're pretty understanding about what's going on. And I mean, usually, I generally deal with seed oils just by what I order, because I'm so diligent about it everywhere else and I don't go to restaurants all that often. I don't really worry about it all that much. But gluten, I have to be really careful about. And typically, I just tell the server when they first come up to the table, "Look, here's the deal. Why don't you go back to the kitchen and negotiate what I can eat?" And I mean, I have a pretty good idea. I'm not going to order the fried chicken because I know that's a no-go. But
yeah.
You can order a steak, and sometimes they put a sauce with a roux in it, which is flour based. So, but they can delete that or whatever. It's way more easier than it was 10 years ago.
That's good. And I like that if you're diligent on the rest of your life, and I don't go out to eat a lot often, and it seems like all the people listening to this don't either. That if there's a time, there's
and that's a great
you can live.
I mean, Dr. Cate was getting into that earlier when she was talking about how well people are eating. I don't go to restaurants because I eat better at home.
Exactly.
I have better ingredients. Now that I've learned how to cook, I just have better meals. For me, the only advantage most of the time of going to a restaurant is either a new experience or like to go to an ethnic restaurant or something like that. But generally, the meal I get is not as good as the meal that I'm having at home.
We can. Exactly. Because you're getting the better sourced meats, you're getting probably more organic vegetables and, or at least fresh vegetables. Some of the restaurants, depending, they just have stuff that sits around for so long before they use it, because that's just cheaper that way. And they pre-cut things, so like when you have an onion, you cut it the day that you're using it, but they buy pre-diced onions, which is all the edges are oxidized and the flavors are, well, a lot of the flavors are already gone. So learning to cook is really a life-saving kind of experience. And that's the hardest thing, that when I work with folks who just hate cooking, I try to help them understand that, look, you don't even have to cook. You just have to make sandwiches, for example, that are made out of the right kind of mayo, and peanut butter that doesn't have seed oils in it, right? So I have a lot of actually resources on my website. Maybe you can link to the shopping list that I put together. It's for all the folks that I work with at ABC. They've just found it really useful because I get down into all kinds of, like, what kind of sandwich meat should you get? Well, it's the nitrate-free kind. And where do you find it? What aisle is it in? And that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that really is the most important resource for most people, I think, is just, okay, now what do I eat?
Mm-hmm.
I distinctly remember figuring out, when I first figured out that I was gluten intolerant, having literally a panic attack. I was like, because I called myself Mr. Whole Wheat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought that was healthy. I mean, I was following the guidelines, and I remember literally having a panic attack, thinking to myself, oh my God, I'm going to starve to death.
Mm-hmm.
So what am I going to do? And it seems so funny now, all these years later, because I eat so much better and I'm so much happier. And aside from, the only thing I miss is croissants, but other than that,
Mm-hmm.
you get over it. I don't even worry
Yeah.
about bread substitutes, because for so long they weren't available and I just got out of the habit. And it's just, I
Well,
don't even miss it,
there's
man.
no need. There's no need. I did a post, but I don't eat anything with my hands anymore. Just, you don't need to eat burritos and pizza and bread. I eat great food on a plate. Don't mess with the substitutes. I think it just slows people down and screws people up. But to hear more of Tucker's story, you can go back to the first episode too, of his health transformation and how he's improved. I'm trying to wrap up all the points we did here at the
I'm glad
end.
I'm not the host.
Dr. Nadir Ali, awesome guy. He was on the podcast. Awesome cardiologist, understanding that LDL, what Tucker was talking about is there's different kinds of LDL, and there's small dense and there's light, you know what I mean? There's different LDL that's bad and good. And I think Dr. Cate mentioned in the very beginning that you can have high LDL and it can be bad if you're eating a bad diet, right? But if you have a good diet and you're insulin sensitive and you have good HDL and low triglycerides and all these other things, and you have high LDL, then maybe it's not so bad, which is kind of what we've been laying out.
And
So
which is the research Dave Feldman's been doing, showing
Dave
that.
Feldman, that's
Yeah.
another good wrap up point. He's been on the show. He's awesome. Anything else we need to wrap up here? I think we're good.
No, I'm trying to inspire myself to do a proper takedown of this post now that I've got it in front of me. We've gone through things.
We can do it. Just know that we can link to that in the post.
Everybody saw how exasperated I got just talking about it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to write that much on it.
Check your blood pressure.
Yeah, well, it was good to look at some of the arguments so we could break them down. And yeah, I guess the final wrap up and circle back would be just the hammer and the nail, and that it's kind of all the refined grains and sugars come with seed oil. So that's part of the problem too, right? Is that they come with all these foods. They're hyper palatable. People overeat them.
It's interesting. One of the healthier grains, if you're going to eat it, is rice. And the first thing they do in rice is they remove the N6 fats. That's what's in the bran.
Right.
It's in the husk. Yeah. Well, I went through decades thinking that the brown rice was a healthy one because it has more fiber, right? That's what we were told. It's eat the brown rice. But yeah, that's probably the bad part. So, eat the rice.
One other silly aside that springs to mind. In the early 1900s, they were looking at feeding rice bran oil to pigs, and they decided it was too unhealthy for them because it gave them soft fat. Dr. Cate was talking about how it builds up in the adipose tissue. Now they're feeding it to human children. So that's where we've come in 100 years.
Yeah, it's one of the most common seed oils used in restaurants is rice bran oil.
Yeah, it's very neutral.
It's cheap, probably too. High smoke point, cheap, all this stuff. All right, well, we've done 2 hours here. Hopefully, people enjoyed this deep dive on all this stuff, and hopefully they don't eat seed oils anymore. Thank you so much for coming on, and I'll link to
so nice
both
to
your
meet
sites
you,
and
Cate.
blogs.
Yeah, no, so nice to meet you. And thanks so much for the conversation, the chance to have the conversation, Brian. That's great.
It was great. Yep. And Fat Burn Fix is Dr. Cate's book. We'll link to their site and Tucker's blog. What's your website?
yelling-stop.blogspot.com, and I'm on quite active on Twitter as @TuckerGoodrich.
Awesome. And Cate, on your online presence? Are you online?
drcate.com. Yeah, so it's drcate.com. And my website has a great search feature. So just if you just put in the search feature on my website, like shopping list or AHA or Ansel Keys, there's a lot of information along the lines of what we talked about, and resources, just the free resources there.
Perfect. Well, thanks again. And I'll see you guys sometime soon, probably.
Great.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing with a friend. Thanks for giving it a review on iTunes or any podcast app. Go to nosetotail.org to look at all our meat products and other awesome stuff like the beef tallow body care, the seasonings, the artwork, the hats. Go to sapien.org and be a member of the tribe and get 20% off those items and 10% off the fresh meat products. And get all the other perks and benefits in the private members area that we have. Sapien.org. Also find the program there. Lose weight, change your life. We got your back. I'll see you next time, which will be in early March. Thanks, everyone, and take care.